investing in property makes sense, investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakelin Property Advisor. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 62 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So there's been plenty of discussion in recent times around the rental crisis in the media specifically. So I've decided to bring in our rental guru today, Jarrod Telfer. Welcome, Jarrod.
Thanks, Jarrod. Good to be here again.
So we wanted to discuss a number of hot topics, particularly around the rental crisis or so-called rental crisis that the country's experiencing. We'll obviously focus more so on Melbourne because that's what we know. But there has been a fair amount of angst from both sides in this space, both from investors and from tenants. So Jordan and I thought we'd discuss that today. Now, we're not claiming that we're going to have all the answers to all of the problems or the topics that have been raised, but we wanted to look at perhaps some of the practical discussions going forward and things that need to be considered before either side of the argument is going to put forward their ways of fixing the problem and whether or not all elements have been considered. So probably the main one, Jordan, that we've heard about and that's been probably front of mind, and it's probably been toned down a little bit in recent times with some of the federal government discussion, has been the rental freeze and the caps on rental increases. So what are your thoughts there? I mean, it has been toned down, so it's probably a little bit of a moot point now, but I think it's still worth going into a bit of detail on.
Yeah, it is. They're probably the two obvious ones that have been thrown up from a Victorian perspective. Yep. And using precedent, I suppose, overseas and also interstate. So particularly in Canberra, where yep. there's or in the ACT, there's caps on rentals.
There's some in New Jersey. I think there was a study done in New Jersey or something, but there's also some in California around San Francisco and things too, isn't there?
The New Jersey one, I think, more relates to rent controls.
Right.
So it's more along the line of rent freezes. Yep. That sort of thing.
Yep. I think there's an element too there though of only being able to increase rents by 3 or 4% over a certain period of time is what I was reading too. So there's definitely something. There's definitely controls there. Yeah. But from what I've also read, I don't think it's having the greatest of impact either.
Well, there's pros and cons as with most things, isn't there?
Yeah.
And what some researchers have drawn a line or a link between is those properties that have some form of rent control on them, is that there's a disincentive for owners to actually maintain their properties.
Yeah, and that's what's been found. So it's all well and good to have these controls, but the incentive to actually then go and maintain them because they're not able to increase income is not there, and that's sort of almost flies in the face of the Residential Tenancies Act changes that were brought in a year or two ago, and some of those were a little bit over the top, but a lot of them were genuine and absolutely fair and reasonable. Yeah. So it's you sort of, with one hand saying we want you to increase and make it a better quality of property, but in the other we're not giving the ability to be able to do that.
Creating the environment for that, really. Yeah. And if there's a disincentive, well then that ultimately impacts the quality of the property that are being presented to people for rent, and probably ultimately the numbers of properties there that are available. Yeah.
So I mean, the rental freezes. I guess some of the issues that have been raised with that, I think, which are genuine, is that by doing that, it's also happening too in a time where a lot of investors suffered fairly significant losses during the pandemic, and made rental reductions for tenants, rightly, and there was support given to tenants to be able to get through that time, but they've worked their way through it only to now, when the market starts to work in the owner's favour, to have that turned away. And then when you get interest rates increasing the way they have over the past 18 months, you get, as we said before, the changes to the Residential Tenancies Act, but also the land tax changes that are coming in next year. It seems like there's a lot of things that are being a lot of headwinds that are being put in front of them. Yeah,
it's sort of death by a thousand cuts. Yeah. The rental freeze, I think people forget that really, in effect, if people are like the Greens policy at a federal level, that I think in the last few days anyway, that with the housing fund that the Albanese government has finally come to agreement with, they've dropped that demand for a 2-year. But certainly in Victoria, there's in effect a rental freeze anyway for 12 months. You
Yeah.
sign up a 12-month lease,
You're
you
only
can't rent it anyway. So what they would argue is, well, we're looking for one more year.
Yeah.
But what it is, it's at a practical level and also, I suppose, at a subconscious level. I think a lot of private investors certainly feel that, well, this is just another layer of cost or
Prevention.
restriction as to how they can run and manage their own properties. Those that, the Residential Tenancies Act, we won't go too far there because I think, as you said, Jarrod, a lot of that is reasonable.
And you and I have had discussions about that in previous podcasts as well, about what's been brought in there. And as you said, we've said in the past, a lot of it was fair and reasonable and justifiable to make sure that properties are being brought up. The problem with the changes is that it probably hasn't hit those that it needed to hit, because a lot of the so-called slumlords and things, that they're not formal leases in place on any of those properties anyway. So
they're working in the shadows.
Correct.
And they never engage a property manager who it's incumbent on the property manager to do their best anyway to make sure that the Residential Tenancies Act is being adhered to.
Correct.
So
it's sort of slipped through the cracks, doesn't it?
Yeah, they do. But then there's obviously the land tax. COVID levy, supposedly temporary, but when it's over 10 years, it's not temporary.
No.
So that's going to draw in and capture a lot of people whom the idea of paying land tax never crosses their mind.
No.
The threshold having been
especially
reduced.
apartment owners. Yeah.
Apartment owners, particularly. So that's on fairly modest site values. People could be looking up to $975 that they wouldn't have had to have even factored in. Now, that's considerable.
And it only goes further from there then too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as you move through. So, I mean, there's already 2 to 3 weeks of rent just gone like that.
Yeah.
So, again, on top of all sorts of other costs, mortgages, interest rates, insurance costs, OC levies we're noticing starting to rise, and we're looking at contracts for various apartments, and sometimes justifiably they needed to, but it's just another thing one after the other.
As you said, death by 1,000 cuts,
Yeah, it doesn't encourage certainly the private investor market.
And then what that leads to, as you said before, is we don't get the reinvestment in the quality of the properties either. And part of that's contributed further by the fact that there is such high demand at the moment. It had been going where, and I know a lot of the advice that you'd been giving to our clients was that, particularly with apartments, the older style apartments need to keep up with the more modern ones. But when the rental market starts to move the way it has, and there's such a low vacancy rate, it probably takes a bit of the pressure off the investor to have to do that, because there is tenant demand for possibly lesser quality, which there wouldn't have been 18 months ago. But they are less likely to reinvest into property, or, which we're starting to see a lot of, and agents are saying, they're just going to sell.
Yeah.
And particularly in the apartment, and from what I'm hearing, the townhouse market, that's where a lot of people are getting to that point where they just say, well, this property's either served its purpose, or it hasn't served its purpose, or it's too expensive for me to hold. I'm just going to move on, and I'm going to either invest my money in a different type of property or in a totally different asset class.
Yeah, outside of the property market in general. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of things there that well intentioned with the capping rental increases, rent freezes. Interestingly, Victoria is in the last month or so said that they're not considering now the capping rental increases.
Yep.
Rent freezes. I think that's still a bit who knows.
I think they have tended to step away from it, though. I think with as you said before, with the federal government's housing scheme coming through, I think that's sort of made everyone step back from the caps and the rent freezes.
Yeah. The other thing too that I think is worth a discussion, and it's quite timely actually, because this morning there's a report on an expectation that next week the Victorian government will place a 7.5% levy on Airbnb, or I shouldn't say Airbnb because they're just a provider of, but the short stay accommodation market.
Yep.
And that would be 7.5% levy tax, call it what you will, on a nightly rent.
On top of any management fee and things that is being charged. Yeah.
So I mean that will obviously feed through eventually through to the
rent, so to speak.
The guest, if you like. But that's expected next week to be one of the announcements. So
have they announced when that's likely to kick in? Is it a 24 thing? Or?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
Yeah, that was just this morning that I quickly read an article on that. But that was mooted for a little while now. And the idea being to draw a revenue source to then invest in social housing, more housing in the areas, and they tend to be the tourist areas. So, for instance, say Mornington Peninsula, where the local market has been shut out probably over the last few years, probably since COVID, shut out of their local rental market and creating all sorts of problems. Whether that has the desired impact, we'll wait and see.
Time will tell.
Because again, it's trying to encourage people to take their properties and put it back onto the long-term market, the local long-term market. But I think it fails to consider the fact that I think in the Mornington Peninsula the average stay is about 50 to 52 days a year. That is actually leased out, for want of a better word, to the short-term rental market. But a lot of these people who own these properties, they own it for that dual purpose of, leasing it out, but that's their holiday home.
Yeah, I'll get some use out of it myself too.
And so I don't think it's going to encourage an awful lot of people to say, well, I'm only leasing out 50 odd days a year, but I enjoy the use of that for, Easter, end of the year, whatever it might be. So
I think you'll find exactly as you said that all it's going to do is just drive up the cost of occupying those properties.
Yeah, and it doesn't get to the ultimate, the crux of the issue, as we'll find, whichever market we look at, the ultimate issue is supply. So the Airbnbs tend to be in the tourist areas. There's just simply not enough of that type of property.
No.
So what do we do? Do we build more? Well, that creates all sorts of problems as well, and that can fly in the face of why people like those parts of the world.
Yep.
It's an escape from the intensity of a city.
Yep.
So, but that's a story for another day.
So your supply comment there is good. It swings us into the next. So there's been a lot of discussion around how to, I guess, improve the rental situation that's around at the moment. And I think most people agree that the area that needs fixing is supply. That's where that's the way that we're going to ease the pressure on it. Easier said than done. But there's typically probably 3 avenues to increasing supply. And I think that's probably something worth us having a discussion about. So the 3 avenues that can increase the supply levels from a rental perspective are typically government housing.
Particularly social.
Yep.
Social housing.
Whether it's the private investor getting involved, which is obviously where we're heavily situated, and the developing is that institutional side of things and the build-to-rent type scheme. So let's have a look at all 3 of those. So if we start with government housing, it can typically be a bit of a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. It needs to be a lot of planning put in place and understanding what's needed. And my thought has been that for a long period of time, the idea has been to step away from that. There's been let's have less reliance on government housing and more on private ownership, people owning their own properties where possible, or private rentals. So it would be a switch back to what people, a previous time, and I don't necessarily think that's the right way to go. I think with all of these, though, it's probably there needs to be an element of each of them increasing. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I don't think, there's no appetite for government to be increasing supply broadly based across the market.
No.
I think that they've
probably got enough debt at the moment as it is too.
Exactly. I think there's a societal expectation that government at least looks after the social housing side of things and
they're probably taking out the rental crisis. There's still a shortage of social housing anyway.
Has been for years.
Yeah.
So that's probably, I think that there's the expectation that government looks after that side of things, but it leaves a big vacuum for of demand for other more orthodox sectors of the market.
So the second one is the private investors, and as I said, that's where the space that we're probably most active in. And the problem, I guess, that we're seeing at the moment, as we said before, is that the feeling from most private investors is that it's being discouraged rather than encouraged.
Yeah, we're being got at.
Yeah.
So, it opens up a whole different, almost philosophical discussion as to what is the purpose of property. Yeah. Is it as an investment vehicle, or should it be purely viewed in terms of shelter for people? And if there is a philosophical objection from government for private ownership, well, that's one thing, but the vacuum needs to be filled. I don't necessarily agree with that, but the vacuum needs to be filled. So who fills that vacuum? Is it institutional? And we're seeing a significant focus now on the build-to-rent market.
Yep.
They tend to be more apartment-type developments.
Yep.
At least in the early, we're very much in the early stages here in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne,
Yep.
with that model that's more common in the United States and Europe. But it's an interesting one, and I think it has a place.
But it's got to be a generational shift in mindset too. I mean, the thing too, I think is that people need to get past is this, coming back to the private investors side of things, is that these big bad private investors that own huge amounts of property, they're big rich people that are waving their big sticks around at tenants. When I think I read somewhere the other day, 70% of investors only own one investment property. So there are many people that own a huge number of investment properties, but there are a lot that only own one.
Yeah.
And a lot of those have battled their way through COVID to make sure that they can still hold that property to try and set themselves up for retirement, perhaps help their kids get into the market down the track as well. We need private investors. You can't keep discouraging them from entering the market by continuing to put costs on top of them to make it harder and harder to own properties.
Unless, of course, there's a plan for that vacuum to be filled, because private investors are a significant part of the market, the housing market, and the supply of housing.
Yeah.
And there's been tacit encouragement for a generation or two now for people to involve themselves in that process. So there needs to be an alternative if there really is a desire, and it seems that way, to discourage the private rental market.
But the other side to that too is that part of that, I mean, it's how are you going to supply alternate rental properties? But a lot of investors are using those properties when they come to retirement to fund that retirement. And if you're not going to give them that opportunity to do that, then they're going to have to look at other avenues, or they're going to rely on more government support when they're in retirement, which I don't think anyone needs or wants either. So there's private investors are not just there for their own perspective. They're there to help a lot of others as well. Now, that's not necessarily their mindset. I'm not claiming that they're doing it for
all altruism.
No, absolutely not. But there's benefits to everyone else off the back of that too.
Yeah.
So which brings us to that institutional side of things, which you mentioned. And I think that's probably going to be the way to have the fastest impact in terms of increasing supply. But it does need to be a mindset shift from an occupant's perspective too. As you said, it's been far more common in America and in Europe, but it hasn't been that way here. The good thing about it, I think, is that the institutions, even though you might say, well, are they going to build the right type of accommodation? Is there going to be too many apartments? And there will be, because that's the easiest way to introduce it, I would say, into the market. But longer term, they're going to have to meet the market. If they're not constructing the type of property that tenants and occupants want, then they're going to have high vacancy rates, and they're not going to have properties that are well maintained. And
to provide the income that underpins the whole model.
Correct.
There's returns that are needed. It's very black and white. There's returns that are needed. Otherwise, it's not an investment that they want to be involved in. Now, there will necessarily be, I would expect, a premium rent. But then if the provision of services that they can introduce to this sector of the market resonates with people, well, they may well get that premium.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I guess it differs in terms of meeting the rental market to the build-to-sell market, where the build-to-sell market focuses more on, we just want to get rid of the product and we want to make a profit out of that product. We're not really worried about what the next stage is. And so if the product isn't of high quality and within 5 to 10 years it's not falling apart, but certainly not necessarily holding together all that well, tenants aren't going to cop that in the build-to-rent model. It's got to be built for the long term, so that the quality in that side of things should be better too. So it should work in a lot of those ways for those occupants, I would have thought. Yeah. The other thing is too that they can typically build those types of properties, you would like to think, within areas where infrastructure is already readily available, as opposed to developers continuing to worsen the urban sprawl, particularly that Melbourne has, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But the infrastructure is just not there to justify, particularly from a public transport perspective.
Yeah, I think the key though is It's supplying the type of property in the locations where people want to live, but providing accommodation that people want to be in and what they need.
Yep.
And I think that we need to just to get away from this model, and this is the probably more cynical developer-driven model of, well, look, get them up and get them out. 1 and 2 bedroom dog boxes that are glorified hotel rooms that really don't resonate with what Australians are probably looking for and Melburnians in big numbers. Now, you can have apartment living, and I think that it is a bit of a mind shift for Australians, sort of growing up and used to the outdoor spaces of their own plot of land. But you can provide apartments into the market, provided there's also greater consideration given to the supporting infrastructure and the amenity. People can probably come to it if the product is right.
Communal open space is going to be a big part of these developments, I think. And I think if that's not supplied or catered for in these developments, then particularly if they do only have small outdoor spaces attached to the property, so for balconies, that sort of thing. If there's not a really good quality communal open space element to them or fairly close by, it's going to make them
very marginal.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. There's too many of these developments that have had the open space, look great on the plans, but in reality, after a couple of years, they're either windswept. There's no vegetation. They're just heat boxes during summer with some paving, a rudimentary sort of barbecue area, and they're just unwelcoming. And typically when we're going through these apartments, they're never occupied.
No.
People don't tend to use them. It's just not providing the type of amenity that people are looking for.
Yeah.
So there needs to be really good design elements brought in, but it's not impossible.
No.
And people can get a really lovely quality of life in an area that they want to be in, close to the infrastructure that people tend to gravitate towards in those urban, in the urban areas, but in an apartment context.
Yeah. Very good. Well, that's probably about it, I think. I think that's covered off. As we said at the start, we weren't here to try and answer everyone's problems or questions, but it was more to discuss the different elements to make sure that there's a different perspective given on all. We think that, I guess, particularly the private investor and particularly the build to rent is probably going to be the best way to increase that supply level. But there needs to be a little bit less discouragement. I don't want to say more encouragement. I don't think it needs to be a big encouragement for investors. It just needs to be less discouragement. And I think that's probably where a lot of investors are feeling a bit marginalised at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. That's what we're seeing anecdotally, certainly.
All right. Very good. Thanks again, Gordo, for coming in and joining me.
Thanks, Jarrod.
So thanks for joining us for episode 62 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. As always, feel free to share the podcast far and wide, friends, family, colleagues, or anyone else who has an interest in property. And if you'd like further information, visit our website, wakelin.com.au, and we wish you all the best with your property decisions.